All right, and we are live. This is the first episode of In Transit with your host, Lucas Rodriguez, and that's me. And this would be a podcast for those who are interested in international trade, whether you're in the industry or not. Um, it's something that comes up quite often. I think it's an interesting industry and something that I think a lot of people don't really know that much about. There's not a great online presence, in my opinion, and it's relatively interesting, something that has a lot of different facets when you talk about geography, business, finance, politics, foreign policy, technology, and data. There's a lot of stuff that goes into, how you get your products when you go to Walmart or when you go to Amazon or things that people don't necessarily always think about. And that's something that I want to uncover a little bit more and perhaps shine some light and talk about some current topics that are always of interest. Let's talk about the first major topic, the one that everyone's talking about, tariffs. And that's the word of the year, probably, in our industry and maybe even overall. Remains to be seen what Merriam-Webster decides to do at the end of the year. But we can talk about what is a tariff, because I think that probably has gone a little bit under the radar, ironically. There is a tariff assigned to every single product that comes into the United States. There's a big book called the HTS, and basically we adopted it in I think the late 80s, like 1989, and it literally breaks down every single possible item that could come into the United States and assigns it a code. Now, that code could just be used for reporting purposes because some governmental institution wants to collect data on a specific industry, but a lot of times it's also used to assess what we call a duty rate or a tax rate or tariff rate. Those are all kind of interchangeable. One of the things people might not realize is there is actually almost always tariffs present on products. That's one of the things that is kind of key to take away here. A lot of them at least have a 0% rate, meaning that that code is entered just for the purposes of reporting. Now, sometimes there is a code. Maybe it's 2-3%, depending on what the specific product is. If it's tiles coming in from Italy, they might have 2-3% on them for whatever reason that the government decided to place a small tariff on them. There's also other types of tariffs. There's anti-dumping and countervailing duties. Anti-dumping has to do with tariffs on products that severely undercut American markets. Countervailing duties have to do with when foreign governments subsidize a specific industry or a specific manufacturer. Why would they do this? Some of the reasons include, let's say, pollution concerns. Like in the United States, we have environmental regulations that don't allow us to pollute the way that, let's say, companies in India or China might be able to get away with because they don't have that regulation. Slave labor issues, obviously, currency manipulation. So it's basically punitive on those countries, basically saying if you're an importer, you're going to have to pay a little bit more because these people can get away with stuff that American businesses can't get away with. And so they can come in, they can undercut the market because they don't have to worry about maximizing profit. They don't have to worry about regulations in the same way that we do. So we're going to tariff them so that we can kind of be on the same playing field. So, it brings up that idea of fair trade versus free trade. So tariffs are protectionist tools that governments can turn on or off to achieve specific policy outcomes. They're often used to shift international markets and supply chains towards fair and honest practices. So that idea of free trade versus fair trade. So with that out of the way, that's basically what a tariff is. And then we can look at the Trump tariffs, which are, it's a little bit different. A lot bit different, actually. Let's start with the intended impact. So let's start on the campaign trail and maybe the rolling out process of the tariffs. It's unclear what the specific rationale was, because there's multiple rationales. Primary, they talk a lot about revenue generation. They want to pay off the debt. They want to replace the income tax. They want to create a tariff dividend. Remains to be seen if the tariff dividend will occur. Probably not. In terms of paying debt, it's a very, very small amount. proportionally of what we were bringing in. Now, on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars, which is not nothing. It's a lot of money, obviously. But when the debt is in the trillions, you're not really making a dent on the debt, a debt dent. And as far as replacing the income tax in the same vein, the government makes way too much money on the income tax, and the tariffs were not even close to that number. Something close to $1 trillion, I think, for income tax and revenue generation thus far this year, something like maybe 100, 200, 300 billion, depending on how the year finishes out. It's not enough to really leave a mark. Um, there's national security motivations. So we're talking about the fentanyl crisis. Countries like Canada, Mexico, China, they're getting punished via tariffs for their involvement. Remains to be seen how that's affected that issue. You have the economic emergency argument, which we'll get into later with the Supreme Court case, but the idea is we're running a trade deficit. There's a trade imbalance with the rest of the world. Other countries impose tariffs on us, and so we got to go impose tariffs on them. Couple questions there. Are we actually in an economic emergency if we're in a trade deficit? You could argue yes, you could argue no, and I'm sure we'll get into that, the specifics of that in a later video. How does countries imposing tariffs on us and us retaliating actually get us to a better place? Difficult to answer at the moment. And then probably the most famous reason we're bringing back manufacturing. I think you could argue that we've been over reliant as a country on foreign countries for manufacturing. That being said, we have the largest market, so we do have leverage in that sort of sense. Like, they need us more than we need them, is kind of the argument. And so at any point, we can kind of bring back our manufacturing base and have the market to support it, but that takes time. And so that's something that is not easily answerable at the moment. So the tariffs essentially are punitive, especially in the national security sense. We're going to tariff a country because they're involved in the fentanyl crisis. Doesn't really have much to do with an economic or like it's not revenue generation. It's not a trade imbalance issue. It's not a manufacturing issue, which you could always understand the argument in those cases. But in the case of national security, it's punitive. It's literally we're going to put a tax on you because you're doing this to our country. And so how does a punitive tax work or a punitive tariff? Well, at the end of the day, the importer in the United States is paying the duty, right? They're bringing in something from another country, they pay the duty. But then what happens? Well, the idea, theoretically, is that we impose a 10% duty on, let's say, anything coming in from Canada. And now an importer that brings in something from Canada is going to reevaluate their supply chain. And they're going to say, okay, if we have to pay an extra 10% tax for bringing in something from Canada, maybe we look at bringing it in from Mexico. Maybe we look at bringing it in from United States or from Singapore or from wherever that doesn't have a 10% tax. And then in the long run, they move their supply chain. And then the tariffs have that intended effect of getting out of that country. So that's part of it is we want to get out of the countries that we're tariffing. At least that's the theory. And so what else happens? So in that case, the manufacturer risks losing their business, right? So what's something they could do? Well, maybe they lower their prices to cover the amount of the tariff, and then the importers don't have to pass along that cost to the consumer. Sometimes they absorb that cost, sometimes they pass it along. Depends on the product, really. Depends on the industry, what the margins are. Let's go to the actual impact. So did revenue generation make a dent? To this point, we could probably say no. Could it replace the income tax or create a tariff dividend? Probably not, if we're being honest. Did national security improve? Did the border situation improve? I think it did. Could you argue if that was due to the tariffs? Probably not. That was probably just a difference in policy between the administrations. One was tougher on the border, and so the border situation got better. I don't know if it was necessarily because Canada and Mexico said, okay, we're getting tariffs, let's improve the border situation. Maybe, to some extent. But I do think there's pressure regardless. Was there an economic emergency? And did tariffs help? Hard to say if it was an economic emergency. You could say that the over-reliance on other foreign countries may be more of a geopolitical emergency than an economic one. Maybe that's semantics. Did the tariffs help the situation to this point? It's only been 6, 7, 8 months, but not really. I don't think there's been really much of a change. I think people are trying to outlast it. The way that it's been rolled out has been pretty chaotic. It's been pretty up and down, left and right, and nobody knows how to make heads or tails of it. That hurts the ability of people to make long-term decisions on their supply chain because they don't know if tomorrow we make an agreement with another country and, hey, never mind, no 10% tariff on Canada, everything's fine. So we don't know. That's up in the air. And that was kind of one of the unintended consequences of the tariffs. You could say it wasn't broadcast. I think it became apparent, but a lot of the tariffs were just a negotiating tactic to get people to come to the table and say, okay, let's reorganize our trade and let's just get rid of the tariffs. That was just to get you guys to scare you a little bit to come to the table. Um, Not really sure, how that ends up. Not really sure how successful that was. There's been a few good cases, like in Japan, United Kingdom, where we did sit down at the table with them and we got something out of it. But for the most part, that hasn't really happened yet. The manufacturing return, not really. I think people are still trying to wait it out and see what happens. Foreign companies invested in US facilities. I mean, that kind of happened. There's been a lot of investment from big companies like Apple and Hyundai and countless big companies, um, and big countries. A lot of the Middle Eastern countries, they pledged, all right, we're going to invest in the United States. The companies go, we're going to build large data centers in the United States. We're going to bring manufacturing, computer chips. But I don't know how large of a scale that ends up being because it's one thing to pledge it, it's another thing to follow through on it. So we'll see. And then finally, I mean, low volumes and high uncertainty for the importers, very, very low volumes. People are scared to import because they have no idea what the tax on the import's going to be. You could put it on the water, and then the next day went from a 10% to a 50% tariff. And now the something that you thought was going to cost you $5 and you were selling it for 7, now it costs you 7.50 and you still got to sell it for 7. And it's difficult to ship a lot of volume on that uncertainty. It's been a lot of frequent, spontaneous changes, which prevents the supply chain from efficiently charting a path forward. Um, it's kind of a mixed bag on the tariffs, to be honest. A lot of this is going to be a hindsight is 2020 kind of thing, and we'll see how it ends up being. I think for the most part, you can say they haven't been as successful at doing the things that they said they were going to do. You could argue there's been a number of roadblocks. You could argue that these are more long-term in their nature, so you kind of have to wait and see how they play out. You got 3.5, basically 3 years left. So who knows? Maybe it was all a negotiation tactic, and in a year there's no more tariffs and the freest trade you've ever seen. Maybe the United States gets a lot out of these deals. Maybe manufacturing does come back. Maybe the revenue generation explodes. Who's to say? Another point we could bring up is the actual legality of the tariffs, which is in question now, specifically the IEEPA tariffs. So not all the tariffs, only the ones that have their authority granted under the IEEPA, which is the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. And so there's a stipulation in the act that says that the president is allowed to essentially regulate importation. And so that's the question. Does the president have the power to unilaterally levy tariffs, which are technically a domestic tax, because as I mentioned, the importers are paying them. And domestic taxes, the power to levy a domestic tax is typically reserved for Congress. Congress can sometimes delegate the power to tariff to the president. such as in Section 301 and Section 232, which are other types of authority that tariffs have asserted. And so the question is, does IEPA actually assert that power to the president? So this includes the fentanyl tariffs that we talked about. This includes the reciprocal tariffs, which was that big sign that he brought out in April on quote unquote Liberation Day. That's a country specific tariff, so it's 10% on Spain, 15% on China, something like that. That was the big 125 that we saw for a while on China, and then recently Brazil and India tariffs. India for bringing in Russian oil. Those are up for debate right now, and so this is at the Supreme Court. The current question is how and when the judges will vote. And so we heard the oral arguments, and they expressed, let's say, skepticism, even though it's a majority conservative, quote unquote, conservative, given that the Supreme Court is supposed to be impartial. And so, reading into this case a little bit more, we stumbled upon something called the major questions doctrine. And it's the idea that the Supreme Court will decide if there's a case that's significant enough to be called, let's say, like a major question. And what ends up happening is they say basically if there isn't an explicit granting of power, then it's not good enough. So the phrase regulating importation, you could argue, includes the right to tariff. But since it doesn't specifically say the right to tariff, then under the major questions doctrine, this would be struck down. And so the question is, are they going to invoke that major questions doctrine or not? That's probably the biggest question. If they do, then the tariffs are probably gone. And if they don't, then the tariffs will probably stick around. And on the question of impartiality, the Supreme Court to this point has more or less sided with the administration. They more or less sided against the Biden administration. Maybe they want to be more impartial. Maybe they check Trump here. As I said, who's to say? We still don't know. And we also don't know when this is going to happen. Could happen next week. Some people are saying could happen as late as next June. And if you're an importer, that's a little bit scary. Because next June's a long time from now, and you're paying a lot of importation duties. So this brings us to the next kind of big topic in the industry, which is hedge fund involvement in the tariff refund process. So let's say that the tariffs get struck down and the government now owes hundreds of billions of that revenue generation, owes it back to the importers. What's going to happen? Well, we don't know if those refunds are going to be automatic or manual, basically meaning, and if you've ever dealt with the IRS, then you know that more than likely they're not going to make it easy to get your money back, which means the refunds are most likely going to be a manual process. You're going to have to enter and apply for all of those tariff refunds, and that's going to take probably a lot of effort. It's probably going to be a painstaking process, and there's a lot of uncertainty around that at the moment. But in any case, let's say that they refund the money. If you're an importer and you're strapped for cash, one of the things that's occurring is hedge funds are going to importers and saying, we're going to buy that responsibility from you. Let's say you paid $1 million in tariffs this year. Hedge fund comes along and says, okay, you paid $1 million. We'll give you 800,000 right now, right off the bat. And let's say you're strapped for cash. You're desperate. You don't think you're going to make it until June. Well, maybe you'll take that deal and you make 800 grand right now. If you're the hedge fund, you paid 800 grand and now you have the rights to the tariff refund. June comes around, you make $1 million, you paid 800 and you profited 200 grand, and that importer got their money, maybe when they didn't think they were going to make it a few more months. And we don't know the specifics right now on the hedge fund contracts, but let's say that they're unconditional. So let's say no matter whether the tariffs go up or down, an importer pays $1 million in tariffs, the hedge fund comes around and says, we're going to pay you 800 grand. And the importer says, I don't think these tariffs are going to get struck down. I'll take the 800 grand. And they make 800 grand and the hedge fund's out of luck. You might ask, why would the hedge fund do that? Well, maybe it's a conditional payment. We don't know. The other thing we're thinking is, what do the hedge funds know that we don't? That's a possibility. And, there's also that issue of automatic versus manual. That's interesting to think about. So we'll see what happens there. And then finally, let's get to Section 232. So one of the things that's still not being discussed that much is the fact that not all the tariffs are being stricken down. Potentially, could be none of them, depending on how the Supreme Court rules. But regardless, one of the kind of batches of tariffs are called Section 232 tariffs. They derive their authority from some governmental code, Section 232, where Congress specifically granted permission to the president, just like in Section 301, to impose a tariff. And that's explicitly stated rather than in the IEPA case where it's not. And so that's why that's up in the air. One of the things that's happening with Section 232 is it's a tariff on a product like copper, steel, metal, but it's not just copper or steel or metal. It's things that are made out of copper, steel, and metal, right? So you might buy, let's say, a stainless steel product and, the manufacturer didn't just, make it out of thin air. It got raw steel, made the product, and then they sold it, and they include extra costs than just the cost of the raw steel. They include the labor cost and they include their overhead and all of those sorts of things, and that goes into the price. And then that price gets paid by the importer, and then they resell their product at an even higher price, right? It's usually how it works. And everyone along the way, gets their little cut. Now, what's happening? Well, let's say you make a stainless steel product and you used to bring it in for $10. And now what's happening is there's a 50% duty on steel. Well, what happens? Now you're paying $15 when you used to pay 10. Maybe that's not good enough for you. And so what's something that you might do? And what's something that, let's say, the industry at large is kind of doing right now with regard to these products? You might say, well, I'm going to interpret this as a tariff on the raw steel, not a tariff on the entire amount of the product that I'm bringing in. So it's essentially a devaluation of the goods that are containing metal. And the thing is, we don't really have a lot of good guidance from customs at the moment. All we have is the FAQ on the website stating that the customs valuation should be used to determine the amount of the tariff paid. Typically, the customs valuation is what is the amount that was paid by the importer in the transaction? What is the amount that's on the invoice? And that typically is going to include whatever the manufacturer is selling their product at, which includes their own costs, not just the cost of the raw steel. It includes their labor and includes their overhead. So it's a devaluation. You can't just say, like, I bought this stainless steel product for $10 and 5 of it is raw steel and 5 of it is labor and other costs. Well, I'm only going to pay tariffs on $5, not all 10. Typically, that's not how it works. And the imports reporting only the raw metal costs, excluding labor and manufacturing costs. It's a little bit of a distortion. It's a compliance issue for sure. And that's something that customs to this point hasn't really said anything about. Could be a massive issue because it's happening industry wide, especially with a lot of the larger importers, and they're setting the standard for the industry, and people can't really keep up with those prices. If you're not paying tariffs on the entire cost of your product, only a little bit of it, it creates a little bit of a competition issue. And so that's something to track moving forward. All right. So that about wraps it up. That's kind of all the stuff I wanted to talk about this week. I think that was a pretty good first go of it. A little bit rough around the edges, but we'll get better. I'm sure we'll get some better lighting and maybe a better microphone or something like that, but I think it went pretty well. All right. Like, subscribe, comment anything interesting, and yeah, we'll see you next week on In Transit.